The California sun beat down on the Warner Brothers lot with relentless intensity that August afternoon in 1955. Sound Stage 16 stood like a massive industrial fortress amid the sprawling studio complex, its exterior offering no hint of the creative tension brewing within. Inside, nearly 200 extras milled about in 1950s teenage attire, leather jackets, poodle skirts, and slicked-back hair, as they waited for the next scene of Rebel Without a Cause to begin. James Dean arrived late, as had become his habit. He slipped through the heavy door, red jacket draped casually over his shoulder rather than being worn as costuming had intended. At 24, Dean had already gained a reputation for being difficult, brilliant, and unpredictable in equal measure. His recent performance in East of Eden had turned heads across Hollywood, but here on the Warner lot, director Nicholas Ray was beginning to wonder if the young actor's talent was worth the headaches. "Nice of you to join us, James," Ray called from behind the camera, not bothering to hide his irritation. The cast and crew had been waiting 40 minutes, and the delay was costing Warner Brothers money by the minute. Dean didn't acknowledge the rebuke. Instead, he tossed his script onto a nearby chair and lit a cigarette, drawing deeply as his eyes surveyed the meticulously constructed high school set. The scene scheduled for today was straightforward, a brief exchange between Dean's character, Jim Stark, and the other teenagers at the high school. Nothing special, just exposition to move the plot forward. Natalie Wood approached Dean cautiously. At 17, she was playing Judy, the female lead opposite Dean's troubled teenager. Despite her years of experience as a child actress, Wood seemed genuinely intimidated by Dean's intensity. "We're on page 63, she said, offering him her copy of the script. "Did you want to run lines before we start?" Dean took another drag from his cigarette and shook his head. "I know what I need to say." Sal Mineo, playing Plato, the youngest member of their troubled teenage trio, watched from across the set with undisguised admiration. Like many young actors in Hollywood, Mineo had fallen under Dean's spell, captivated by his method approach and naturalistic performance style. Nicholas Ray called for quiet on the set. The assistant director echoed the command, and the bustling soundstage gradually fell silent. Makeup artists made last-minute touches on the principal actors while cinematographer Ernest Haller checked light readings through his viewfinder. The scene was set in the high school hallway, where Jim Stark would have a brief confrontation with the group of privileged teenagers who had been tormenting him. "Remember," Ray said, addressing Dean directly, "this is just about establishing the tension between Jim and the other kids. Nothing too dramatic here. We're saving that for the observatory scene next week." Dean nodded absently, eyes focused somewhere beyond the set. Those who knew him recognized this distant look. He wasn't ignoring direction so much as disappearing into his character's mindset. The script supervisor approached Ray with a concerned expression. "He hasn't even looked at today's revisions," she whispered. Ray sighed. "Let's just get this in the can. We're already behind schedule." As the extras took their positions and the principal actors hit their marks, an unusual energy seemed to emanate from Dean. The cigarette dangling from his lips was not in the script, but Ray decided not to mention it. Sometimes with Dean, it was better to pick your battles. "Sound? Speed," came the reply from the sound technician. "Camera? Rolling." Ray took a deep breath and called out, "Action!" What happened next would upend everyone's expectations. Dean stood motionless for a moment, his face a mask of teenage defiance that somehow communicated volumes without a single word. The script called for him to deliver a simple line about being new at school, but the words never came. Instead, the silence stretched uncomfortably long, building tension in a way no dialogue could have achieved. The other actors exchanged nervous glances, unsure if Dean had forgotten his lines or if something else was happening. Corey Allen, playing Buzz, the leader of the rival teenagers, tentatively delivered his line as scripted. "What are you looking at, new boy?" Dean's response was to slowly remove the cigarette from his mouth and exhale a perfect ring of smoke that drifted between them like a challenge. This wasn't in the script. Neither was what came next. As the afternoon light filtered through the set windows, casting dramatic shadows across his face, James Dean seemed to transform before their eyes. The restless energy he'd been containing all afternoon was about to explode in a moment of pure, unscripted authenticity that would forever change the trajectory of Rebel Without a Cause. No one saw it coming. Not Nicholas Ray, not the veteran crew members who had worked with Hollywood's most temperamental stars, not even Natalie Wood and Sal Mineo, who had spent weeks rehearsing with Dean. The transformation was instantaneous and electric. In one fluid motion, James Dean grabbed the nearby wooden chair and slammed it against the wall with such force that splinters showered across the polished floor of the high school set. The violent crash echoed throughout Sound Stage 16, causing several extras to flinch involuntarily, genuine reactions captured perfectly by Ernest Haller's roving camera. "You think you know me?" Dean shouted, his voice cracking with emotion that hadn't been written into any version of the script. "You don't know anything about me." The rawness in his delivery silenced everyone on set. This wasn't just acting. It was something more primal, more authentic. Dean paced like a caged animal, running his hand through his carefully styled hair until it stood disheveled, mirroring the internal chaos of his character. Corey Allen, playing Buzz Gunderson, stood frozen, the scripted lines forgotten. He was no longer an actor on a Hollywood set, but a teenager confronted by a force he didn't understand. The camera captured his genuine confusion, the momentary flash of fear in his eyes. "Say something," Dean challenged, moving uncomfortably close to Allen's face. "All of you, with your perfect lives and your perfect families. You think that makes you better than me?" Nicholas Ray made a subtle gesture to keep the cameras rolling. Whatever was happening transcended the written page. This was the essence of Jim Stark, the alienation, rage, and vulnerability that defined an entire generation of post-war teenagers, distilled into one unscripted moment. Natalie Wood, displaying instincts beyond her 17 years, sensed the opportunity unfolding. Rather than waiting for her scripted entrance in the scene, she stepped forward into the frame. "Not all of us have perfect families," she improvised, her voice soft but resolute. Dean turned to her, momentarily surprised by her intervention, but quickly incorporating it into the emotional current he had generated. Their eyes locked in a moment of unspoken understanding that communicated more than pages of dialogue ever could. "Then why pretend?" Dean asked, his voice suddenly dropping to an intimate whisper that technicians scrambled to capture. "Why put on this act every single day?" The question hung in the air, resonating beyond the fictional exchange to touch on the fundamental artifice of their profession, of Hollywood itself, of the societal masks everyone wore in 1950s America. Sal Mineo, taking his cue from Wood, moved into the scene. His character Plato, younger, more vulnerable, and desperately seeking connection, approached Dean with hesitant steps. "Maybe because it's safer than the truth," Mineo offered, the line emerging from some intuitive understanding of his character rather than the screenplay. Dean's response was to laugh, a hollow, bitter sound that contained multitudes, pain, recognition, and a strange kind of liberation. The laughter transformed his face, softening it momentarily before the hardness returned. The extras, initially frozen in surprise, began to respond organically to the scene unfolding before them. Some shifted uncomfortably, others watched with undisguised fascination. The documentary-like reality of these reactions added layers of authenticity that no direction could have achieved. Dean moved to the center of the hallway set, all eyes following him. The red jacket, which had been casually draped over his shoulder when he arrived, was now worn properly, the collar turned up in what would become an iconic image of teenage rebellion. "You want the truth?" Dean continued, addressing not just the fictional teenagers surrounding him, but seemingly the entire soundstage, the cameras, perhaps even the audience who would eventually witness this moment. "The truth is, we're all scared. We're all lost. And none of the adults have any better idea about how to live than we do." These words, improvised and unplanned, captured the emerging generational divide that would define the latter half of the 1950s and explode into the cultural revolutions of the 1960s. In that moment, Dean wasn't just acting. He was channeling the collective unconscious of American youth. The traditional power dynamics of the set had been completely upended. It was no longer Nicholas Ray directing Dean, but Dean directing the emotional truth of the scene, pulling authentic reactions from everyone present. The boundaries between performance and reality had blurred beyond recognition. As the improvised scene reached its emotional peak, Dean suddenly returned to the script, but transformed it. Taking a line that was meant to be delivered calmly, he instead infused it with all the emotional context he had just created. "You're tearing me apart," he shouted, the words directed partly at the fictional teenagers, partly at the society that had created this pressure cooker of conformity and rebellion. The line, delivered with such visceral intensity, would become one of the most quoted in film history. And then, as suddenly as the storm had erupted, Dean brought it to a close. He took a final drag from his cigarette, which had somehow remained lit throughout the entire impromptu performance, and extinguished it beneath his boot with deliberate slowness. The action created a perfect punctuation mark to the scene, a period at the end of an emotional sentence no one had anticipated. In the sudden silence that followed, the only sound was the whirring of the cameras, still faithfully recording what had just transpired. Everyone on Sound Stage 16 knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when cinema had transcended its boundaries to capture something raw and real. Nicholas Ray, his director's chair abandoned long ago as he stood transfixed behind the camera, didn't immediately call cut. He understood that what had just happened was bigger than the film they were making. It was the voice of a generation, speaking through James Dean's unscripted fury and pain. The silence that descended upon Sound Stage 16 was profound. For several seconds after Dean's final gesture, no one moved, as if breaking the stillness might somehow diminish the power of what had just occurred. The cameras continued to roll, capturing the aftermath, the genuine expressions of awe on the faces of extras, the subtle exchange of glances between Natalie Wood and Sal Mineo, and James Dean himself, slowly emerging from the depths of his character as his breathing steadied. Nicholas Ray finally called, "Cut," his voice softer than usual. The words seemed to release the collective tension in the room, and the buzz of conversation immediately erupted as crew members turned to one another, attempting to process what they had witnessed. Ray remained motionless behind the camera, his trademark sunglasses masking his expression, but the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his cigarettes betrayed his emotional state. Jack Warner's personal representative on set, a studio executive named Hal Thompson, immediately approached the director, his face flushed with a mixture of concern and irritation. "What the hell was that, Nick?" he demanded in a harsh whisper. "That wasn't in the script. We're already 3 days behind schedule and over budget. We can't afford to waste film on Dean's theatrics." Ray took a long drag from his freshly lit cigarette before responding. At 44, the director had already established himself as someone who understood the changing landscape of American cinema. His previous film, Johnny Guitar, had pushed boundaries in its own way, and he recognized the cultural shift that Dean was embodying. "We're not wasting anything," Ray replied calmly. "What just happened is exactly what this film is about. But it's not in the approved screenplay," Thompson persisted. "Warner expects the film we agreed upon." Ray removed his sunglasses, fixing the executive with a direct gaze. "Warner expects a hit, Hal. That's what I'm giving him." Across the soundstage, the film's screenwriter, Stuart Stern, flipped frantically through his script pages, trying to reconcile what he had written with what had just played out before his eyes. As the primary author of Rebel Without a Cause, Stern had crafted a story that aimed to capture the emerging phenomenon of teenage rebellion, but even he seemed stunned by the raw authenticity Dean had brought to the moment. "I don't know whether to be insulted or amazed," Stern confessed to the script supervisor sitting beside him. "He completely ignored my dialogue, but somehow said exactly what I was trying to convey." The assistant director approached Ray cautiously. "Should we set up for another take, Nick? Get back to the scripted version?" Ray's response would prove to be one of the most significant directorial decisions in the production. He took a moment, watching as James Dean conversed intensely with Natalie Wood and Sal Mineo in the corner of the set. The 3 young actors were animated, riding the emotional wave of the improvised scene, their connection palpable even from a distance. "No," Ray said finally, the single syllable carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "We're not reshooting. Leave it exactly as it is. Don't touch a thing." Thompson started to protest, but Ray cut him off with a raised hand. "What we just captured was pure truth, Hal. You can't direct that, you can't write it, and you sure as hell can't replicate it. If we tried to reshoot, we'd get something polished but dead. This is alive. Ray's decision sent ripples through the production team. The cinematographer, Ernest Haller, nodded in quiet agreement. A veteran who had won an Oscar for his work on Gone with the Wind, Haller recognized exceptional material when he saw it. The lighting wasn't what we planned, he acknowledged, but it worked. When he moved into that shaft of light during his speech, you couldn't choreograph that more perfectly. The sound recordist approached with his own concerns. We got most of it, Nick, but there were moments when he was almost whispering. I'm not sure how clean the audio is. The imperfections are part of it, Ray insisted. This isn't about technical perfection. It's about emotional truth. We'll make it work in post if we have to. As the crew began to reset for the next scene, Ray crossed the soundstage to where Dean was now sitting alone, seemingly exhausted by the emotional expenditure of his performance. The young actor looked up as the director approached, a hint of defiance still visible in his posture. That wasn't what we rehearsed, Ray said, his tone neutral. Dean met his gaze steadily. No, it wasn't. You want to tell me what happened out there? Dean was quiet for a moment, searching for words to explain something that had been largely instinctual. The script felt contained. Too neat. Real teenage anger isn't neat, Nick. It's messy and contradictory, and it comes out of nowhere. Ray nodded slowly. I'm keeping it. A flicker of surprise crossed Dean's face. Despite his confidence in his approach, he had clearly expected resistance from the director whose vision he had just overridden. All of it? Dean asked. Every frame, Ray confirmed. But I need to know if this is how it's going to be moving forward. Are you going to surprise me in every scene? The question wasn't asked with anger, but with genuine curiosity. Ray was recognizing that he was dealing with an actor who worked in ways that traditional Hollywood structures weren't designed to accommodate. Dean considered the question seriously. I can't promise I won't, he admitted finally, but I can promise it will always be in service of the character, of the truth of the moment. Ray held Dean's gaze for a long beat before a slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Then we'll figure it out as we go. Just try not to give Thompson a heart attack. Warner Brothers frowns on executives dying on their sound stages. Bad for morale. The tension between them dissolved into a moment of shared understanding. What had begun as a potential power struggle had transformed into a creative partnership, with both men recognizing that they were creating something that transcended the usual boundaries of filmmaking. As Ray walked away, he overheard a conversation between two young extras who were watching Dean with undisguised admiration. That wasn't acting, one whispered to the other. That was real. That's why they call it the method, her friend replied knowingly, though it was clear that what they had witnessed went beyond any formal technique taught in acting classes. Ray smiled to himself. The studio executives might not understand what had happened today, but the young people who would eventually comprise the film's audience certainly did. Dean had tapped into something authentic, something that spoke directly to the experiences of American teenagers in ways that carefully crafted dialogue could never achieve. By choosing to preserve Dean's improvised scene rather than demanding adherence to the script, Nicholas Ray had made a profound statement about his understanding of the changing nature of American cinema. The rebellious spirit that Dean had channeled wasn't just the character of Jim Stark, it was the emergence of a new approach to filmmaking itself, one that valued authentic emotional expression over rigid adherence to convention. As the day's shooting continued, something had shifted on the set of Rebel Without a Cause. The barrier between script and spontaneity had been breached, and in that breach lay the possibility of capturing something truly revolutionary. A film that would speak to its generation not through the careful construction of Hollywood artifice, but through the raw power of emotional truth. On October 27, 1955, Rebel Without a Cause premiered at the Astor Theater in New York City. The timing was tragically significant. James Dean had died just 4 weeks earlier in a car crash on September 30th, transforming what should have been a celebration of emerging talent into something more somber. The unveiling of a legacy abruptly cut short. The audience that filed into the theater that night had no idea they were about to witness a performance that would define not just a film, but an entire cultural moment. The Warner Brothers. Executives sat tensely in their reserved seats, still uncertain about the film they had produced. During the final editing process, there had been heated debates about Dean's improvised scene. Some had argued for cutting it down, reshaping it to more closely resemble the original script. But Nicholas Ray had fought fiercely to preserve it intact, and eventually his vision had prevailed. This isn't just a movie about teenagers, he had insisted during a particularly tense meeting with Jack Warner himself. It's about the breakdown of communication between generations. Dean's scene shows that breakdown more powerfully than any scripted dialogue ever could. As the film unfolded on screen, the audience's response seemed to vindicate Ray's decision. When the improvised scene began to play, something remarkable happened in the theater. The customary shuffling, whispered comments, and rustling of candy wrappers ceased entirely. The audience fell into a collective silence, leaning forward in their seats as Dean's unscripted performance filled the screen. The power of the moment translated perfectly from the chaotic energy of that day on Sound Stage 16 to the carefully composed frames of the finished film. In the darkness of the theater, teenagers in the audience saw themselves reflected in Dean's rage and vulnerability. Parents recognized the emotional turbulence they witnessed in their own homes, but rarely understood. Critics who had come prepared with clever phrases and cultural references found themselves simply watching, absorbed in the raw authenticity unfolding before them. When the scene concluded and the narrative moved forward, there was a palpable release of tension in the theater, as if everyone had been holding their breath. By the time the film ended, it was clear to everyone present that they had witnessed something revolutionary. Rebel Without a Cause wasn't just another juvenile delinquency picture, it was a cultural document that captured the emerging voice of a generation. Bosley Crowther, the influential film critic for the New York Times, wrote in his review, "There is a moment in this film when Mr. Dean transcends mere performance and achieves something rarely seen in American cinema, absolute truth. It comes not through carefully crafted dialogue but through what appears to be a spontaneous eruption of the character's inner life." What Crowther and other critics didn't know, what only those who had been present on the Warner lot that day in 1955 knew, was just how spontaneous that eruption had been. The secret of Dean's improvisation was carefully guarded by the production team, creating the illusion that the scene's power came from meticulous planning rather than creative defiance. In the months following the film's release, its cultural impact began to expand beyond cinema into the broader American consciousness. Teenagers adopted Dean's style, the red jacket, the distinctive slouch, the brooding intensity. His portrayal of Jim Stark became a touchstone for a generation struggling to articulate their alienation from the prosperous but conformist society their parents had built. Natalie Wood, promoting the film after Dean's death, was frequently asked about working with the young actor. She never revealed the full extent of what had happened during the improvised scene but would say, "When you acted with Jimmy, you never knew exactly what was going to happen. He kept you in the moment because he was always completely in the moment himself." Sal Mineo, whose career had been launched by his role as Plato, spoke more directly about the experience years later. "What you see in that scene isn't acting in the traditional sense," he told an interviewer in 1971. "It was more like a controlled explosion. We were all just trying to keep up with whatever Jimmy was channeling that day." Nicholas Ray's career continued to evolve, with films like Bigger Than Life and Wind Across the Everglades, but he would always consider Rebel Without a Cause his most important contribution to cinema. In his later years, as he lectured at film schools and retrospectives, he finally began to share the story of Dean's improvisation. "The most important decision I made as a director on that film," Ray would tell rap students, "was knowing when to get out of the way. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is recognize that something extraordinary is happening and just let it happen." Film historians and scholars eventually pieced together the full story of the improvised scene, analyzing how this single moment of creative spontaneity had influenced the evolution of screen acting. The line between the method approach taught by the actor's studio and Dean's more intuitive, almost feral performance style became a subject of academic study and practical inspiration for new generations of actors. Martin Scorsese, discussing the influence of Rebel Without a Cause on his own work, observed, "That scene changed everything. Before Dean, American film acting had rules, boundaries. After him, those boundaries were never quite as solid again." There's a direct line from that moment to Brando in Last Tango in Paris to De Niro in Taxi Driver. As film technology evolved and behind-the-scenes documentaries became popular, footage from the set of Rebel Without a Cause gained almost mythical status among cinephiles. The few surviving production photographs that captured Dean during the improvised scene became iconic images, studied by actors and directors seeking to understand that elusive moment when performance becomes something more than performance. By the early 21st century, Rebel Without a Cause had been preserved in the National Film Registry, recognized for its culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant contribution to American cinema. Film schools around the world use the improvised scene as a teaching tool, analyzing how the spontaneous interaction between Dean, Wood, and Mineo created a dynamic that no script could have anticipated. What began as a moment of creative rebellion on a Warner Brothers sound stage had become an essential part of cinema history, a testament to the power of authentic emotion over planned perfection. The irony was not lost on those who knew the full story. The most carefully studied, analyzed, and imitated scene in a film about teenage rebellion was itself an act of rebellion against the very system that produced it. James Dean's tragically short career, just 3 films as a leading man, left the world wondering what might have been. But in that single unscripted moment on the set of Rebel Without a Cause, he had achieved something rare and precious. Immortality, not through longevity but through the perfect crystallization of a truth that continues to resonate with each new generation that discovers it. The scene that Nicholas Ray had the wisdom to leave untouched became more than just a powerful moment in a single film. It became a bridge between the carefully controlled filmmaking of old Hollywood and the more emotionally raw, authentic cinema that would emerge in the decades to follow. In those few minutes of improvised brilliance, James Dean hadn't just created an unforgettable character, he had helped change the very language of American film.